$85,000, Mom. Gone. Every cent. I held the phone toward her, my voice trembling. Lenore didn't even look up from her tea. We needed it more than you, Auri. Don't be selfish. Selfish? I choked out. That was my life savings. Maelis smirked, adjusting her new diamond bracelet. It's just paper, sis. Besides, what's yours is ours. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just smiled. A cold, final smile. See you in court, Mother. As I turned my back on their stunned silence, the present dissolved into the memory of where the betrayal truly began, back to the night I arrived with a heart full of hope. The iron gates of the Carver estate groaned as they swung open, a heavy metallic sound that usually signaled safety, but tonight felt like the closing of a trap. Snow drifted lazily through the Greenwich air, coating the ancient oaks in a deceptive, pristine white. I pulled my car up the winding driveway, the headlights catching the flicker of 100 golden candles glowing behind the Georgian windows. For 5 years, I had stayed away, building a life in the city with nothing but a forensic accounting degree and a relentless work ethic. Tonight, I was the youngest daughter returning home, the one they always called too sensitive for the cold world of high finance. I took a breath, the cold air stinging my lungs, and told myself that love was not found in what we take, but in the sanctuary we provide for one another. Inside, the house smelled of expensive pine and wood smoke. My mother, Lenore, met me in the foyer, her silk dress rustling like a warning. She hugged me, and for a fleeting second, I let myself believe the warmth was real. Auri, darling, you're finally home, she whispered, her voice a practiced melody of maternal affection. My sister Maelis stood by the fireplace, swirling a glass of vintage Bordeaux, her eyes scanning my modest wool coat with a pity that felt like a needle prick. Beside her, Hollis, my brother-in-law, offered a thin, predatory smile that never reached his eyes. We sat for dinner, and as the porcelain clinked against silver, I felt a rare sense of belonging, a foolish hope that my professional success had finally earned me a seat at their table. After the meal, under the towering spruce in the library, Lenore handed me a small rectangular box wrapped in the silver foil. A reward for your unwavering support, Auri, she said, her expression a mask of soft devotion. Inside was a brand new iPhone, the latest model, sleek and cold in my palm. I was deeply moved, my throat tightening with a gratitude I hadn't felt in years. I reached into my bag and produced my own gift for her, a vintage gold locket containing a photo of my late father. Wealth is fleeting, I told her as I clipped it around her neck, but the history we share is the true legacy. I acted from a position of emotional abundance, unaware that while I was offering my heart, they were harvesting my life. I spent the rest of the evening setting up the device, logging into my secure accounts to check my year-end bonus, my fingers tapping against the glass in the quiet of my childhood bedroom. I didn't see Hollis watching from the doorway, his silhouette dark against the hall light. I didn't know that the phone was a Trojan horse, pre-installed with sophisticated spyware designed to capture every keystroke and digital key I owned. I went to bed feeling secure, dreaming of the independence my savings would soon buy. The morning of December 26th arrived with a sky the color of lead. The holiday glow had vanished, replaced by the biting gray reality of a Connecticut winter. I woke up early, the house silent except for the hum of the furnace, and sat at the small oak desk to finalize the down payment on my dream apartment in Brooklyn. This was my bridge to a new life. I opened the Chase Bank app, expecting to see the $85,000 I had painstakingly accumulated through 80-hour work weeks and skipped vacations. My thumb hovered over the screen. The numbers didn't make sense. I blinked. The cold seeped into my bones through the floorboards. The balance was $2. Panic tried to claw its way up my throat, but my forensic training took over like a cold shutter snapping shut. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I sat perfectly still, my knuckles whitening as I gripped the phone. Being a good daughter doesn't mean being a doormat. I realized that respecting oneself is the highest form of integrity. I began to scroll through the transaction history. 4 wire transfers, initiated at 9 p.m. the previous night. while I had been laughing at the dinner table. The money had been moved to an offshore routing number I didn't recognize. The very gift I held in my hand had been the knife they used to cut my throat. I walked downstairs to the sun-drenched breakfast nook, my footsteps hollow on the hardwood. Lenore was there, elegantly spreading marmalade on toast, while Maelis lounged across from her, scrolling through a social media feed. The atmosphere was clinical, sharp, and utterly devoid of the warmth from the night before. I placed my phone on the table between them. "The account is empty," I said, my voice steady, a low vibration that seemed to rattle the crystal jam jar. Lenore didn't look up. She merely sighed, a sound of weary disappointment. "We needed that money, Auri. You have a high-paying job and no responsibilities. It's for the family." "You stole it," I replied, the word hanging in the air like a frozen breath. Maelis finally looked up, her lip curling in a sneer of practiced gaslighting. She reached into her silk robe and dropped a stack of papers onto the table. Forged invoices and investment agreements. "You authorized these months ago, Auri," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Mom and I have been so worried. You've been working so hard blacking out, forgetting things. It's the stress." "They weren't just taking my money. They were attempting to delegitimize my sanity to protect their theft." I looked at the forged signatures, the ink still fresh, the logic of their lie as flimsy as the paper it was printed on. A lion does not turn around when a small dog barks, and I refused to engage in the frantic defense they expected. They thought they had trapped me in a maze of my own making, but they forgot that I am the one who maps the labyrinths. I realized the family wasn't just stealing my past. They were trying to seize my future. I closed my laptop slowly, the click sounding like a gavel in the quiet room. The sun hit the mahogany table in the breakfast nook with a cruel golden brilliance that didn't match the ice forming in my chest. I looked at my mother, Lenore, as she delicately set down her teacup, the china clicking against the saucer with a sound so final it felt like a door locking. She didn't look like a thief. She looked like a woman who had just finished a pleasant morning prayer. There was no tremor in her hands, no guilt in her eyes, only a weary, practiced patience that made me feel like an unruly child rather than a woman who had just been robbed of her entire future. True family isn't defined by blood, but by the safety and respect we afford one another. Yet in this room, blood was merely the ink they used to forge my name. I spread the digital printouts across the lace tablecloth, the black ink of the wire transfers clashing with the elegant setting. $85,000, Mom, I said, my voice vibrating with a controlled fury I didn't know I possessed. 4 transfers, all made while we were opening gifts. Lenore didn't even glance at the papers. She simply smoothed her silk napkin and sighed. "Auri, don't be so dramatic. We didn't take it. We utilized it. You've always been so successful, and the family is struggling. It's a collective resource, dear. Think of it as a family tax for all the years we carried you." The absurdity of her words felt like a physical weight. I had worked 80-hour weeks, skipped meals, and lived in a cramped studio just to build that safety net, only to be told it was a collective resource for people who hadn't worked a day in years. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table. "I would have given you everything if you had only asked with honesty," I whispered, my heart breaking for the mother I thought I had. "But you chose to steal the one thing money can't buy. My trust." She didn't flinch. She just sipped her tea, her silence a wall I could no longer climb. The heavy oak doors swung open, and Maelis sauntered in, followed by Hollis. They radiated an air of unearned arrogance that made the air in the room feel thin and oily. Maelis was already wearing a new cashmere wrap, likely purchased with the money that was supposed to be my down payment. They didn't see my distress as a tragedy. They saw it as a nuisance, a fly buzzing in their perfect Greenwich garden. "Are we still talking about this?" Maelis asked, rolling her eyes as she reached for a croissant. "Honestly, Auri, it's Christmas. Stop being so selfish." I turned to Hollis, the man who had pre-installed the spyware on my phone. He stood there with a smug half grin, the kind of look a man gives when he thinks he's too smart to ever be caught. "I want it back, Hollis. Every cent," I demanded, my voice hardening. He laughed, a short, hollow sound that echoed off the high ceilings. He reached into the pocket of his expensive slacks and pulled out a crumpled, greasy $50 bill. He didn't hand it to me. He tossed it onto the table, where it landed next to my forensic audit like a piece of trash. "There," Hollis sneered, leaning against the doorframe. "Consider that payment for your services to the family this holiday. It should be enough for a bus ticket back to the city." The act was designed to strip me of my dignity, to reduce my years of professional achievement to the status of a domestic servant. Maelis chuckled, adding that I should be grateful they left me anything at all. In their eyes, I wasn't a person. I was an asset to be liquidated. I didn't cry. The tears were there, hot and stinging, but I pushed them back with a resolve that felt like iron. I reached out and picked up the $50 bill with 2 fingers, looking Hollis directly in the eye. When people show you who they are, believe them the first time. I didn't see a brother-in-law anymore. I saw a small, desperate thief hiding behind a big house. I tucked the bill into my pocket, not as money, but as evidence of their intent. This was the moment the youngest daughter died, and the forensic accountant was born. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. I stopped being the emotional victim and became the professional predator. I pulled my laptop toward me and began to type, the clicking of the keys the only sound in the suffocating silence. "You think this is about the money, Hollis?" I said, my voice dropping to a chillingly calm register. "No, it's about the fact that I finally see the rot. You see a sister and a daughter you can bully. The law sees identity theft, wire fraud, and grand larceny." Lenore finally looked up, her mask of maternal calm flickering for the first time. "Auri, don't say things you can't take back," Lenore warned, her voice tight. But I was done taking things back. Justice is not an act of revenge, but the restoration of balance, and this family was dangerously out of alignment. I stood up, my posture straight, my presence suddenly larger than the room itself. I told them exactly where the boundaries were now. I informed them that every login, every IP address, and every forged authorization was already being backed up to a secure cloud server. I wasn't just leaving. I was deconstructing their crime from the inside out. Before I walked out, I stopped by the kitchen. Our elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, was standing by the sink, her eyes downcast, clearly having heard the entire shameful display. I walked over and pressed the crumpled $50 bill into her hand. "A holiday bonus, Mrs. Gable," I said softly. "You're the only one in this house who earned anything today." Her eyes filled with tears as she squeezed my hand. It was a small moment of grace, a reminder that I wouldn't let their toxicity change the person I was. I might be leaving with nothing, but I was leaving with my soul intact. I packed my bags in total silence, the house feeling like a tomb I was finally escaping. No one tried to stop me. No one apologized. They just watched from the shadows of the hallway, waiting for me to disappear so they could go back to pretending they were the royalty of Greenwich. I walked out the front door into the biting winter air, the wind whipping around my coat like a cold embrace. Sometimes the only way to save a family is to let the law define its boundaries. I climbed into my car, the engine turning over with a roar that felt like a battle cry. As the heavy iron gates of the Carver estate clicked shut behind me, the sound echoing through the frozen trees, I pulled over to the side of the road. My hands were steady on the steering wheel. I took a deep breath, the air sharp and clean. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I had stored years ago during a corporate compliance seminar. A direct line to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. I didn't hesitate. I didn't look back at the glowing lights of the mansion in the rearview mirror. "My name is Auri Carver," I said into the receiver, "and I'd like to report a series of high-level wire frauds." The drive back to Brooklyn was a blur of highway lights and the rhythmic, hypnotic thrum of tires against cold pavement. By the time I climbed the stairs to my modest apartment, the adrenaline of the confrontation at the Carver estate had faded into a cold, clinical focus. I stepped inside and didn't turn on the overhead lights. Instead, the sterile blue glow of my laptop became the only sun in my small world. The hum of the city drifted through the window, a distant, indifferent reminder that while my life was fracturing, the world kept spinning. I set up my war room on the kitchen table, opening the audit software I usually use to catch corporate embezzlers. The truth is like the sun. You can shut it out for a time, but it isn't going away. I began the forensic descent into my own digital shadow, tracing the ACH transfers through the routing numbers I had flagged in Greenwich. My fingers moved across the keys with the muscle memory of a woman who had spent a decade hunting ghosts in spreadsheets. My year-end bonus, my house fund, everything had been siphoned out with surgical precision. Have you ever looked at your own life through a screen and seen a stranger's hand pulling the strings? The betrayal felt less like a wound and more like a theft of my very identity. I was no longer just Auri, the youngest daughter. I was a case file that needed to be closed. In the middle of my audit, my phone buzzed. It was Mr. Henderson, my elderly neighbor from 4B. His voice was thin and panicked because his pilot light had gone out and the winter chill was creeping into his living room. My own world was a smoking ruin, but I didn't hesitate. I spent 20 minutes in his apartment, the smell of dust and old peppermint surrounding us, until the blue flame flickered back to life. "You're a saint, Auri," he whispered, patting my hand. I squeezed his back, knowing that generosity isn't about what you have in your bank account, but what you offer when you have nothing left. By 2 a.m., the investigation took a sharp, sickening turn. I accessed the New York Secretary of State's business registry, digging through the filings associated with the IP addresses I'd tracked. That was when the noose appeared. I found a registered LLC, AC Strategic Holdings, listed in my name, established 3 months ago using my stolen Social Security number. It wasn't just a shell, it was a ghost. My missing $85,000 hadn't gone into a savings account or a vacation fund. It had been funneled through this entity to pay off high-interest private loans. Hollis's gambling debts weren't just a family secret, they were now my legal liability. My breath hitched as I uncovered a guarantee agreement attached to the LLC's filings. My forged signature stared back at me from the bottom of a document that made me personally liable for an additional $200,000 in predatory debt. My family hadn't just stolen my past savings. They had mortgaged my entire future to save Hollis from the people he owed. The smirk Maelis had given me over that $50 bill finally made sense. They didn't just see me as a bank, they saw me as a criminal shield. I wasn't being loved, I was being used as a sacrificial lamb for their failures. The horror of the situation was a cold, suffocating weight. If I went to the police now, the paperwork made it look like I was the one running an illegal money laundering scheme. Hollis and Maelis had spent months building a labyrinth of lies, and I was the one standing at the center. I sat back, the blue light of the screen making my skin look as ghostly as my finances. It's funny how the people who give you life are often the ones most eager to take it back when it suits them. I felt the invisible noose tightening, but I refused to let it choke the life out of my resolve. I stood up and walked to the window, watching a lone taxi cruise down the street below. Don't let your struggle become your identity. I had a choice. I could be the victim of a $200,000 conspiracy, or I could be the auditor who brought the house down. I took a sip of cold water and felt the liquid settle my nerves. I decided to stop treating this as a betrayal and started treating it as an audit. Every lie they had told, every forged signature, and every unauthorized login left a digital footprint. And in the world of forensic accounting, footprints are just a map to the person who made them. Protecting my family at this point wasn't loyalty, it was self-destruction. Forgiveness without boundaries is just a slow suicide, and I owed myself a life. I spent the next 4 hours documenting the Wi-Fi signatures from the Greenwich estate that matched the login times for the LLC filings. I cross-referenced the metadata on the forged PDF files, finding traces of the software installed on Hollis's work computer. I was no longer just the youngest daughter who stayed quiet at the dinner table. I was the hunter, and I was gathering the ammunition for a war they didn't know was coming. I felt a strange peace as the sun began to rise over the Brooklyn Bridge, a pale golden streak tearing through the night. The burden of the $200,000 debt remained, but it no longer felt like a death sentence. It felt more like an invitation to fight. My family had underestimated me for years, simply because I was quiet. They mistook my kindness for weakness, failing to realize that the most dangerous person in the room was the one silently observing everything. I printed the final document, the side-by-side comparison of my real signature and the shaky, desperate forgery Hollis had made on the guarantee agreement. The ink was still warm from the printer, a physical piece of truth in a world of digital lies. I looked at my name on the paper, the letters sharp and clear, and felt a surge of autonomy that no bank account could ever provide. I was Auri Carver, and I was the one who was going to set the record straight. I gathered the files into a neat folder and placed them in my safe. I whispered to the empty, dawn-lit room, "You wanted me to be your shield, Hollis, but you forgot that I'm the one who knows how to break it." The noose was still there, but as I stood my ground, I realized I wasn't the one who was going to hang. The signature on this paper said Auri, but the ink smelled like a crime I never committed. The drive through rural Connecticut was a descent into a white, blinding void. A midwinter blizzard had turned the world into a jagged landscape of ice and wind, mirroring the exhaustion that had finally settled into my marrow. I gripped the steering wheel, my tires fighting for traction on the unplowed backroads, until the familiar silhouettes of the tall pines signaled I had reached my destination. Aunt Ione's cottage appeared through the snow like a ghost of a gentler time, smelling of old leather-bound books and dried lavender. When I stepped through the door, the professional mask I'd worn like armor finally cracked. I collapsed into Ione's arms, the scent of her wool sweater a sudden, overwhelming reminder that I was still someone's child. Inside the kitchen, the kettle whistled a lonely tune as Ione poured tea, her eyes sharp and knowing beneath her silver hair. She didn't ask for explanations. She simply watched as I stared at the steam, my mind replaying the cold betrayal in Greenwich. I remembered a truth Ione had told me when I was only 10. "Auri, you don't have to set yourself on fire to keep others warm." Back then, I didn't understand that kindness could be used as a weapon, or that my own family would be the ones to strike the match. Despite the $200,000 debt hanging over my head, I felt a strange flicker of peace in the sanctuary. I spent the afternoon helping Ione organize medical supplies for the local charity drive, proving that even when my world is frozen, my core remains untouched by their rot. The silence was shattered by the shrill ring of Ione's vintage wall phone. I watched from the shadows as Ione answered, her face hardening as she listened to my mother's voice. Lenore was poisoning the well, her words a toxic mixture of concern and hidden threats. I heard my mother weaponize Ione's greatest fear, her aging and independence, threatening to initiate a state-run nursing home placement if Ione enabled my supposed delusions. Lenore painted me as a drug-addicted thief, an unstable daughter who had fabricated a story of stolen money to cover her own failures. It was a masterclass in isolation, a strategic strike to remove my last anchor. Ione played the part of the confused, elderly aunt with chilling precision. She agreed with Lenore, her voice wavering just enough to satisfy my mother's arrogance, while her eyes remained locked on mine with a fierce secret fire. "The loudest person in the room is often the weakest," Ione whispered after hanging up the receiver. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, rusted iron key, pressing it into my palm. She told me she had been waiting 10 years for me to wake up and see the woman Lenore truly was. The greed I'd experienced wasn't a sudden lapse. It was a legacy of deception that began the day my father died, starting with the misappropriation of his life insurance. The basement of the cottage was a cold, damp vault of family history. I knelt on the concrete floor, my flashlight beam cutting through the dust motes as I found the old lockbox tucked behind a stack of weathered crates. The iron key turned with a heavy, satisfying thud. Inside was a legal folder labeled Asset Protection, and a USB drive I hadn't seen since the funeral. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I pulled out a draft marriage merger contract. It was a cold-blooded trade. Lenore hadn't just wanted my savings. She had promised my compliance and my financial backing to a disgraced associate of Hollis to clear the family's mounting debts. I found a letter from my father at the bottom of the box, his handwriting a jagged, beautiful ghost. "Auri, your light will attract those who only know how to live in the dark," he wrote. "Protect your spark." I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for a bank account or a down payment on a Brooklyn apartment. I was fighting for my soul, for the right to exist without being a pawn in their desperate social climbing. I realized that closure doesn't come from an apology that will never be given. It comes from the moment you decide you're done being the victim. My sorrow didn't vanish, but it transformed into a cold, clinical resolve that felt like a shield. I sat at Ioni's small wooden table and opened my laptop, the blue light reflecting in the dark windows. I began the process of uploading the data from the USB, the recorded meetings where Lenore and Hollis discussed liquidating my future like I was a piece of stock. Every word was a nail in the coffin of the life I once knew. I felt the quiet power rising within me, a steady vibration of autonomy that replaced the panic. They think they can bury me under a mountain of lies, but they forgot I spent my career learning how to dig through the dirt of the most corrupt corporations in America. I watched the progress bar as the files moved to a secure cloud server, my eyes as cold as the blizzard outside. I looked at Ioni, who was quietly knitting by the fire, her presence the only solid thing in a world of shadows. They traded my future for a seat at a table that was already rotting, and they expected me to thank them for the crumbs. But I am not my mother's resource, and I am not my sister's scapegoat. I am the woman who knows where the bodies are buried because I was the one they tried to bury. The storm outside began to howl, the wind rattling the shutters. But for the first time in my life, the noise didn't scare me. I was no longer running. I was preparing. I realized that the ink on those forged documents might have said my name, but the truth was written in the metadata they were too arrogant to hide. I closed the laptop with a definitive snap, the sound echoing in the small kitchen like a gavel. I looked at Aunt Ioni and felt a surge of empowerment that made the $200,000 debt feel like a small price to pay for the freedom I was about to seize. "They didn't just want my money, Auntie," I said, my voice steady and low. "They wanted my life. Now, I'm taking it back." I stood up and walked to the window, watching the snow bury the world in silence. I wasn't just surviving the gale anymore. I was becoming the gale. They think they have me cornered in a storm of their making. But they don't realize I've spent my whole life learning how to navigate the dark. The first week of January arrived with a biting, clinical cold that even the high-end heating of downtown Greenwich couldn't mask. I stepped into the mediation room of the legal complex, my heels clicking against the marble with a rhythmic precision that felt like a countdown. I expected a discussion about my missing $85,000, perhaps a desperate settlement offer from people who had finally realized their youngest daughter wasn't bluffing. Instead, the room felt like a pre-staged execution. The lighting was harsh, fluorescent, and unforgiving, reflecting off a polished mahogany table that looked more like an altar than a desk. At the head of the table sat Lenore, draped in a soft cashmere shawl, looking every bit the grieving, exhausted mother. She was flanked by two men in expensive suits who radiated the cold energy of hired mercenaries. Before I could even open my briefcase or present my forensic audit, Lenore's lead attorney slid a thick folder across the table. "Auri Carver, you are being served with a petition for emergency temporary guardianship," he said, his voice as flat as a dial tone. I didn't reach for the folder. I didn't need to. I saw the words, psychiatric evaluation, and incapacity, through the clear plastic cover. They had manufactured a narrative that my recent obsession with stolen money was actually a psychotic break brought on by work-related stress. They were attempting to strip me of my legal agency before I could use it against them. The devil is in the details, but salvation is in the truth. And I knew in that second that if I lost this battle, every piece of evidence I'd gathered would be legally erased. I felt the walls of the sterile room closing in, a familiar pressure I'd felt since I was a child in that house. It was the ultimate high-stakes move, a strike designed to lock me in a cage of my own making. I looked at Lenore, expecting to see a flicker of doubt, but her face remained a masterpiece of choreographed sorrow. Have you ever been in a room where the air was thick with lies, yet you were the only one who seemed to be choking? I remained unnervingly still, my breathing shallow and controlled. I remembered the wisdom that a quiet mind can hear the footsteps of the enemy before they even arrive. I wasn't just observing a legal proceeding. I was witnessing the final death of the daughter I used to be. Maelis and Hollis sat on the far side of the room, playing their roles with sickening, cinematic precision. Maelis dabbed at a dry eye with a lace handkerchief, whispering to the court-appointed mediator about how concerned they were for my erratic behavior. She described my forensic audit as a collection of hallucinations and paranoia, her voice a soft, manipulative coo that turned the room's air oily. Hollis nodded solemnly, playing the role of the protective brother-in-law, while his eyes gleamed with the triumph of a man who thought he had finally buried his debts beneath my reputation. They were legally seizing my present identity to protect the past they had stolen. Lenore rose and walked around the table, leaning in as if to comfort her daughter. "For your own good, darling," she whispered, her breath tinged with expensive mint and iced tea. "You're always too vulnerable to the real world, Auri. Let us handle things." The manipulation was so blatant, so cruel, that it almost made me laugh. Instead, I stood still as a statue, observing calmly. It was then that I realized my mother wasn't just a thief. She was a predator who saw the legal system as just another tool for domestic violence. She wanted me to explode, to scream, to prove their psychiatric reports right by displaying unstable emotions. I gave her nothing but a deep, dark silence. The realization was an intellectual awakening that cleared the fog of betrayal. I understood that fighting a sanity battle on their terms was a losing game designed to drain my energy and my credibility. I decided to stop playing the daughter and started playing the predator of numbers. Auri Carver was no longer a victim. She was the auditor who knew where every cent was hidden. I reached for the notice of intent to file and signed it with a hand that was as steady as a surgeon's. I didn't sign it for the civil case they expected. I was signing for a far more permanent separation. I stood up, my posture straight and my presence filling the clinical room in a way that seemed to rattle the attorneys. I picked up a glass of water from the center of the table and offered it to Lenore, who had started to choke up for the benefit of the mediator. It was a gesture of pure, condescending grace. I watched her hand tremble as she took the glass, her composure slipping for the first time as she realized I wasn't afraid. Kindness to an enemy is the sharpest blade you can wield, and I used it to carve my way out of their trap. "I hope you all realize that every lie told in this room is being recorded by the light of the truth," I said, my voice clear and melodic, lacking any trace of the nervous breakdown they had described. "I forgive you for your desperation, Mother, but I cannot respect your methods." I didn't look back at Maelis or Hollis as I gathered my things. I had already initiated an encrypted data transfer of the USB files Aunt Ione had given me. While they were busy trying to declare me incompetent, I was busy sending their digital footprints to an anonymous tip line at the IRS and the FBI. If they wanted to seize my assets, I was going to make sure those assets were hot enough to burn their hands to the bone. As I walked out of the mediation room, the fluorescent lights felt less like a cage and more like a spotlight on their inevitable downfall. I stepped into the lobby, the silence of the legal complex echoing my own internal peace. They think silence is a sign of surrender, but they're about to find out it's the sound of the fuse burning. My name was still Auri Carver, and for the first time in 30 years, I was the one who controlled the narrative. I looked at the gray January sky and felt the quiet power settle deep in my chest like a hidden anchor. I walked out of the courthouse and onto the street, the cold air hitting my face with a refreshing sharpness. I didn't call my lawyer. I didn't call a friend. I just stood there, watching the lawyers and socialites move through their orchestrated lives. I whispered to the horizon, "You wanted to lock me in a cage of your making. You forgot that I'm the one who knows how to bankrupt the locksmith." They had traded my future for a seat at a table that was already rotting, and I was finally walking away from the meal. That's where the true battle started. The Carver estate was a shimmering fortress of hypocrisy as I pulled up the driveway for the Winter Grace tea party. It was mid-January, exactly 2 weeks since the morning I found my bank account drained to a mere $2. The air was brittle and sharp, the kind of cold that seems to vibrate in your teeth. Inside, the house was filled with the elite of Greenwich, women in designer wool and men with soft hands, all sipping Darjeeling and listening to Lenore play the part of the tragic saint. I watched from the foyer as she leaned into a circle of socialites, her voice a hushed, manipulative whisper. She was telling them about her troubled youngest daughter, Auri, and the unfortunate mental decline that had forced the family to seek guardianship. I didn't enter like a victim. I walked into the grand ballroom with my head held high, dressed in a sharp, tailored black suit that felt like a second skin. I was no longer the sensitive child. I was the forensic accountant who had followed the money to the very bottom of the well. Lenore spotted me and froze, her teacup hovering inches from her lips. She tried to recover, stepping forward with open arms for the benefit of the cameras and the crowd. I stepped back, my movement as cold and precise as a blade. "The truth doesn't need an audience to be real, Mother," I said, my voice carrying across the quieted room. "But a lie always needs a stage to survive." I moved through the crowd, greeting the guests with a genuine somber kindness that seemed to rattle the family's narrative. These people had looked down on me for years, but today, they were merely witnesses to an ending they couldn't yet comprehend. Integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is watching, but accountability happens when everyone is. I felt a strange sense of peace as I reached the digital hub for the ballroom's integrated media system. My battle wasn't with the socialites or the town. It was with the corruption that had poisoned my bloodline since the day my father died. The room darkened as the commemorative slideshow was scheduled to begin. Lenore stood by the podium, ready to give a speech about family legacy. But when the projector hummed to life, it wasn't old family photos that filled the 10-foot screen. It was a forensic map of the Carver finances. Every guest watched in stunned silence as the wire transfers from Christmas night appeared in high definition. The IP addresses, the timestamps, and the ghost LLC filings registered in my name. The digital trail led directly from my stolen savings to Hollis's offshore gambling accounts and Maelis's personal shopping sprees. Chaos erupted in the ballroom. Lenore scrambled toward the controls, her face contorting into a mask of frantic desperation. "It's a mistake! She's sick! Turn it off!" she shrieked, her voice cracking the polished veneer of the party. I stood perfectly still by the screen, the blue light of the evidence bathing me in a cold, righteous glow. I didn't need to shout. The numbers spoke with a roar that drowned out her lies. I informed the room that these files had already been delivered to the IRS and the FBI. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a public execution of a criminal enterprise. As the guests began to flee toward the exits, the social mask shattered completely. I cornered Lenore, Maelis, and Hollis in the library, the very room where they had given me the Trojan horse iPhone. Hollis looked ready to bolt, his smugness replaced by a gray, sickly terror. I pulled out my phone and hit record, placing it on the mahogany table. "Why, Mom?" I asked, my voice a low, steady vibration. 85,000 wasn't enough to save this house. What did you really need the money for? The argument that followed was a descent into a darkness I hadn't prepared for. Lenore, thinking she could still manipulate me, broke down. In a whispered, frantic confession, she admitted they hadn't just needed the cash for bills. They used it to pay off a cleaner, a private investigator who had spent 3 years burying the evidence of a fatal hit-and-run Maelis had committed. A local teenager had died on a dark road, and the Carver family had used my life savings to buy the silence of the only witness. They had traded my future to hide a killing. I felt physically sick, a wave of nausea rolling through me that had nothing to do with the money. I thought of the victim's family, people in this very county who had spent years wondering why their child never came home. "I thought you only stole my future," I whispered, my voice thick with a grief that felt like lead. "I didn't know you stole someone else's child." I looked at Maelis, whose only concern was the smudge on her silk robe. I told Maelis that I could eventually forgive her for the money, but I could never forgive the silence she bought with it. I didn't stay for the excuses. I walked out of the library and into the foyer just as the first set of heavy boots hit the porch. 2 federal agents stepped inside, their badges gleaming in the afternoon light. I handed them my phone with the recorded confession and the master file of the forensic audit. I didn't look back at the staircase where Lenore stood, clutching the banister as her world dissolved into sirens and flashing lights. As I walked down the long driveway, The sound of state police cars echoed through the frozen Greenwich trees. The air felt cleaner with every step I took away from that house. I stopped at the iron gates and looked back one last time. Lenore was being led out in handcuffs, her silk dress stained by the slush on the driveway. 2 weeks ago, you told me you needed that money, I thought, as the first snowflakes of a new storm began to fall. Now you're going to find out what it really cost. The money is gone, Mother, but the blood you tried to wash away with it is still on your hands. I walked away not because I stopped loving them, but because I finally started loving myself. The Carver estate was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crime scene cordoned off by yellow tape that flickered like a warning in the pale winter sun. I stood outside the gates, watching the rhythmic flash of blue and red lights reflect off the snow. For 30 years, this house had been the center of my universe, a place of forced smiles and quiet sacrifices. Now, it was just a cold structure of stone and wood, stripped of its prestige. Lenore sat in the back of a black sedan, her face pressed against the glass as she was prepared for transport to a holding facility. She faced multiple federal charges: wire fraud, identity theft, and obstruction of justice. Her attorney approached me with a final, desperate plea, claiming that the family legacy would be destroyed if I didn't retract my statements. I didn't feel the surge of triumph I expected. Instead, I felt a detached, somber pity. I visited the facility one last time, not to gloat, but to offer a sense of finality that I needed for my own soul. "I've brought you a list of public defenders," I said, sliding a piece of paper through the slot. "They are reputable, and they will ensure you are treated fairly." Lenore's eyes filled with tears, her voice cracking as she begged me to think of our blood. I looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. Forgiveness is a gift I give to myself so I can sleep at night, but justice is a debt I owe to the world so others can be safe. You cannot build a kingdom on a foundation of sand and expect the walls to hold, and Lenore had spent her life digging the sand out from under everyone she knew. In the quiet, wood-paneled office of my father's old attorney, Aunt Ione and I sat down to finalize the probate documents. The atmosphere was hushed, the only sound being the scratching of pens on thick parchment. We were executing the legal technicalities of the Connecticut Property Code with a precision that would have made my father proud. Among the digital files on the USB and the physical papers from the old lockbox, we found the final piece of the puzzle. It was a secret deed my father had signed months before his death, one that Lenore had spent a decade illegally suppressing. The lot the Carver Villa sat on, the very ground beneath their feet, had been deeded to me in a protected trust. I didn't just have the money they stole, I technically owned the estate. It was a silent justice, a father's hand reaching across time to protect his youngest daughter. But I didn't want the house. I didn't want the memories or the mahogany. I chose to sell the land to a municipal development project for a new renewable energy and waste processing facility. It was the ultimate checkmate. The sale effectively burned down the elite social status of the neighborhood, devaluing the very prestige my mother had killed to maintain. Using the proceeds from the sale, I fully reimbursed the family of the teenager Maelis had killed 3 years ago. I settled the moral debt they thought they could ignore, ensuring that the truth finally had a voice. It was a clean break, a way to honor my father's legacy by doing what was right rather than what was profitable. Sometimes, the right thing to do is the hardest thing to do, but it is the only way to truly be free. I felt the weight of the last few weeks lifting, replaced by a quiet, steady power that didn't need a mansion to validate it. A few days later, I stood on the porch of Aunt Ione's cottage as the sun began to crawl over the horizon. I packed my car with only the things that mattered: my father's journals, my own records, and a few sweaters. I looked at my bank app one last time. The balance had been restored to millions through my father's trust, but the numbers no longer defined my worth. I went into the local bank and withdrew exactly $2 in cash. I placed the 2 bills in my glove box, a small, physical reminder of the night I realized I was worth more than a family's greed. The only real wealth in this world is the peace of mind that comes from knowing you stood your ground. I hugged Aunt Ione, the scent of lavender and home lingering on my coat as I promised to build a life where family was a term earned through respect, not demanded through blood. I started the engine, the sound a steady hum that felt like the beginning of a long, peaceful song. I didn't look back as I pulled out of the driveway, the rearview mirror showing the Greenwich gates receding into a blur of white and gray. Sometimes, the only way to find yourself is to get lost in a world where no one can ask you for anything. I rolled down the window, letting the biting, cold air fill my lungs until my chest felt light. I looked at the open road heading north, toward a life where I was no longer a resource or a backup plan.